climate conversation, we have with us Dr. Ruth Morgan, Director at Centre for Environmental History at Australian National University. Thank you so much for giving us valuable time, ma'am. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. So what we're seeing, I think, come through with this particular report is a real emphasis now on adaptation. We've talked a lot about the need for mitigation, the need to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we're also increasingly emphasising the need that we need to be adapting rapidly as well, and that it's not enough to wait for disasters to happen, to wait for problems to arise, but we need our governments and all of our communities to act more proactively, to really prepare and to begin to adapt as quickly as possible to the changing climate around us. And I think those solutions, and this comes through the report in all the chapters, is a real emphasis on the fact that our adaptation solutions, to be effective and to be equitable, need to be very inclusive. We need to have communities involved in the decision-making that affects them. It's not enough just to have prescriptive one-size-fits-all policies that come down to us from on high, but rather we need much more participatory approaches to adapting to the conditions that we face in the future, whether you live in a city, whether you live in a rural area, whether you are a smallholder farmer, you've got a say in what's going on. And so I think that's one of the ways that this report is making a real departure from previous IPCC reports, because it's emphasising that adaptation, to be effective, needs to include different people. It needs to have different worldviews. So there's an emphasis here on Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, as well as thinking more carefully about how we can make our adaptation efforts more equitable, because we know that inequity, whether it's in terms of social inequality, economic inequality, whether it's in terms of gender, age, ability, all of these things can make people more vulnerable. So it needs to have a social justice element to it to be more effective.
Is there going to be a huge imbalance between demand and availability of water resources in the near future? How do you see this?
Yes, I think there's a real risk that we will see a real shortage of water, at least in the places where we might need that water. As the climate shifts, as our rainfall and precipitation patterns shift, what we've been used to is slowly undergoing change. And of course, with growing population, with economic growth, with perhaps even existing competition for water, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, there will be shortages of water, or at least we need to prepare now for the fact that there might be shortages, and perhaps with greater attention to adaptation, with better preparedness for changing rainfall patterns and the timing of that rainfall, we can hopefully stave off some of those issues before they become more acute. So I think these are all the reasons why we put together these sorts of reports, so that we can have the latest information, as well as to see how different people around the world are already adapting to these problems. We don't need to go back to the drawing board. We don't need to start at square one every time. We can learn from what is happening in other parts of the world to try and come up with suitable climate solutions to our own problems.
There's a frequent deviation in climate patterns that are threatening the adaptation techniques. What are your views on this?
So something that comes through in this report is a new emphasis on not only the limits of adaptation, that as our climate is changing, some of the options that might have been available to us will start to diminish, that we won't have the full range of options available because of whether the climate is changing too quickly, perhaps ecosystems have not been able to remain as healthy as we might like them to be. So we have fewer options the longer we take to respond to these issues. But another thing that this report has really drawn attention to is maladaptation. So the kinds of adaptive solutions or approaches that are introduced that actually can raise problems, can either increase inequality, they can limit other adaptive options. So bringing out the fact that not every adaptation is ideal, that there could be issues that arise along the way that need to be addressed. And that's something that Chapter 18 really emphasises, that the adaptation and the policies that we are trying to implement around climate change and ensuring that we are in a better position to cope with changes already underway and that we're at risk of, is that they're flexible, and so that they're not locking us into one particular future, because there's so much uncertainty around how the future might unfold, because there's all these different elements that need to be taken into account. So the more flexible we can be, we have a greater possibility of more effective, more inclusive adaptation.
Right, ma'am. And I suppose the adaptation techniques has to be innovative enough and flexible enough, should be regional centric.
Absolutely. We need to ensure that our adaptation techniques are flexible, but also locally specific. Again, a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to necessarily be the best approach, or what might work in one part of the world won't work in another, even down to within our own countries, within our own nation states. There might be a great range of climates, a great range of settings, and a great range of, I suppose, geographic limits that might require us to work with different technologies. And of course, we want to make those technologies accessible. And so that's another element that needs to be brought into this mix. What is affordable and what is going to be most, I suppose, effective in the particular environment in which it's being applied?
While going back to the centuries, do we see any pattern or behavior or practices that we need to adapt or adopt to combat climate change?
Absolutely. I think we can always find really useful, not so much lessons from the past, but we can get a greater sense of the range of options that are available to us when we not only consider the approaches that we're experienced with in the present and the kind of suggestions and policies and technologies that might be available to us in the future, but if we also look back over the centuries of human experience, we can also learn a lot from how other people, other societies, how earlier generations have also dealt with climate change and variability. And what is really interesting, I think, to take away from a lot of those past experiences is that many generations have dealt with climate change before. While it may not be anthropogenic climate change, there have been climate-related disasters and variability from season to season, perhaps from year to year, that has prompted people to perhaps diversify their farming practices. That's a really important one. To tread more lightly, to have a smaller footprint, to consume less. And that is all about, I suppose, making your way of life less vulnerable to shocks, less vulnerable to changes. And that's about a way of life as much as it is about thinking ecologically. And so I suppose there's those sorts of questions or suggestions to take away. And I think we see some of those themes come through the report, particularly when we're talking about how agriculture is likely to be affected by climate change. So by ensuring that our crop systems are diversified and that they aren't monocultures. So there's also an increasing return to traditional crops where possible. So again, that's partly diversification, but it's partly about cultural attachment to particular places and the kinds of meanings that those other crops have to particular communities. I think we can also look even to your part of the world, where I'm aware of what are they, step wells that are being restored in some communities because they're an important source of water. So I think, you know, it's not all about throwing out what we've done in the past and trying to do everything new. It's about looking back to what people have successfully used in the past to cope with change. And I think the other thing that we can take away from how people have dealt with these sorts of climate-related challenges in the past is through collective action, through engaging with community and by working together to resolve these issues. And I think we can learn a lot of lessons from those experiences.
Indigenous communities across geography must be included while framing the climate solutions or adaptation methods.
Absolutely. This is something that's really what we've really emphasised and tried to do in this report is to include and embrace Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. That's something that's been probably overdue in the IPCC reports, and I think it's only very slowly been developing over the since I think 2007. So over the past couple of assessment reports, there's been a slow recognition that it's not enough just to present Western scientific knowledge, that that's actually leaving out a whole amazing array of expertise and understandings and knowledge. If we don't embrace and work with the knowledge holders, we won't get a glimpse of those sorts of options that might be available. And what we also see, it's not only a matter of Indigenous knowledge, but also ensuring that Indigenous peoples are part of adaptation policies and solutions, so that anything that is going to be developed around Indigenous communities actually needs to have Indigenous people involved in that decision making. So it's again about questions of inclusivity and ensuring that whatever adaptation is developed, that it's actually culturally specific and respects the cultural aspirations and goals of that community. So I think that is kind of relevant for all communities, but I think especially in light of the history of exploitation, marginalisation and colonialism, it's especially important for Indigenous peoples to at last have much greater voice and autonomy in the kinds of decision making that is affecting their lives.
I think the inculcation of traditional methods with the scientific knowledge will gonna give a fruitful result somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. It's not an either or situation. I think what comes through in this report is that Indigenous people are themselves combining technical Western scientific knowledge with the cultural intergenerational knowledge that is so familiar to their communities, and actually bringing those two bodies of knowledge together to find solutions that work best for them, and also taking initiative in finding the kinds of approaches that are going to allow them to maintain their lifeways even in a warming world.
Suggestions to overcome from the future water crisis that we are going to have?
Well, I think what we are really going to be struck by as time goes on is the urbanisation of our planet. And of course, a great many of the world's population are based in cities, and not all of those cities are perhaps as prepared as they should be or could be for climate change. And what we're seeing is not only water shortage, but we also need to be aware of a greater intensity of rainfall. And so we have certainly a real concern around what that means for our cities to have more intense rainfall events, because that could lead to more flooding in particular areas. And we could also think more carefully about how we design our cities, how we plan for new developments, and how we might adapt our cities to be better prepared for either more water or less water, or at different periods of time. The other issue that comes under this topic is the number of people living in informal settlements. And that's obviously a very large proportion of the world's population, where all the privileges of water and sewage and sanitation aren't available, or certainly not accessible. And so climate change will exacerbate the situation for those people in terms of the quality of their water supplies, in terms of sanitation, in terms of disease. So there's a really important issue here around trying to improve the access of more of the world's population to these really basic necessities around having access to sanitary services, so that they can lead more healthy lives, even as a climate might be changing around them. So I think when we talk about water crisis, it's important not to think only about drought or flood, but also access to water. And with so many more people in the world moving into cities, and that's where the growth is, we really need to think very carefully about our cities' design and the access and equity of our cities, and what that will mean in a changing climate.
This report is talking about the green cities that make it more sustainable in that sense.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a real, the reports really emphasise across quite a few of the chapters how some countries are investing a great deal in, it has all sorts of names. It can be nature-based solutions, it can be ecosystem based adaptation, it can be sponge cities, but basically to see our cities not just as a built concrete environment, but rather to realise that these are ecosystems too, and to really recognise how we can make our cities more water sensitive by improving stormwater capture and recycling, by whether that's through wetlands and more green space, by being a little bit more, I suppose, creative and flexible in the way that we build buildings, what we rely on for our water supply, where our wastewater goes. I think we have moved on from the sort of one pipe in, one pipe out thinking, to seeing how our cities could actually be a lot more effective with the way they use water.
When we see the socioeconomic changes, do you find that these changes will going to alter the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability?
Well, I think what is really clear in this report is how socioeconomic change, in terms of, say, the income of individuals, of societies, it may be all well and good to increase individual income, but if that's coming at the cost of equity, and if that is increasing social inequality, then that can raise some real problems for the welfare of a large proportion of the population. So I think what we really are concerned about is ensuring that a greater number of people have more access to the kinds of opportunities to adapt their lives and livelihoods to the changes that are already upon us. And so always we want to see people's lives and livelihoods improving, and see people having the opportunity to pursue the kinds of lives they want to lead. But we need to be wary about questions of inequality and what kind of lifestyle some of those people will choose to lead. And we know that Western lifestyles, for instance, are incredibly resource hungry. Whether that's necessarily sustainable has some real questions about it. So I think we need to think carefully about the kind of futures we want to see, and we want to uplift more and more people, but without inequality and not coming at the expense of climate justice for the rest of the world.
Would you like to give youth or communities or societies at every level any suggestion or anything which you truly believe that is going to help in combating climate change? Anything that you would like to suggest?
Certainly, I think what has been really eye-opening for me working on this report over the past few years is the incredible commitment of people in the climate change community, for want of a better word, to getting the very latest research, for working together in spite of all sorts of hurdles and barriers. And I think that gives me a real hope that it's actually working together that is going to be the real, I suppose, lesson that we all need to take on board when it comes to climate change. We need to take collective action to put pressure on our policymakers to follow the scientific advice and to undertake proactive planning and proactive policies that are going to affect the kinds of change, to make the kinds of societies we want to live in. The science is very clear, and I think it has been for some time now. What we need to do and to feel hopeful about is that it's with each other. We can't, that we will make change. It's not, I think, very helpful for us as individuals or for our society if we give up, because that's not going to help at all. If we give up, we aren't going to be a part of making a difference to this climate change problem, to slowing down emissions. So we can make individual choices, and they're very well canvassed, but I think it's important for us to take leadership in our communities and to work with our communities and governments to really encourage and to advocate for change, for dealing with climate change, as it's only going to continue unless there's some rapid action taken. But I think what we see compared to the 2014 reports is that the climate risks that we have been aware of that are on the horizon are actually appearing faster. So they're appearing more quickly, sooner than we anticipated. And one of the issues we see there is that those risks are connected to other issues. They interact with other issues, whether it's economic growth, whether it's natural resource use, whether it's shifting demographics. So I think that's one of the key takeaways, is that we're actually seeing climate change appear on our horizon much more quickly than we anticipated. I think we're also seeing unequivocal emphasis on the fact that the scientific evidence is there. We are certain that climate change is happening, and it's a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet, and that we can't afford to delay any longer, because we will miss out on this window of opportunity to really secure a sustainable future for all of us.
That's great, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing the valuables.